So I'm Helen Roy, and I'm from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and had the great pleasure of working on non-native species in lots and lots of different ways. And today specifically, I'm going to share some of the work that we've been doing around biological recording and through the GB Non-Native Species Information Portal, which is funded by DEFRA and a partnership with the Marine Biological Association, the British Trust for Ornithology, and the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland. But there are so many, many, many people that I could list here to say thank you to, and it just would fill too many slides. So I hope you all know who you are and how much I very much appreciate working with you, and how this presentation would not be possible without all of the contributions from so many, many people. So I thought I would begin straight away by talking about where you can go to record non-native species, because often I'd put this at an end of the presentation, but I thought actually it's really important to be thinking about what action individuals can take with respect to recording non-native species. So we have an online recording form through iRecord, so you can register with iRecord and submit any non-native species at all that you would like to. And if you can put a photo with it, then that's really fantastic, because we can then get someone to verify the records. But then we also have some specific apps. So for example, the Asian Hornet Watch app, but you can also record Asian hornets through the online iRecord system as well. So you don't necessarily have to download the app, but there is a lot of information within that free to download app if you would like to find out more about some of the species, for instance, that look like Asian hornets. And I know you're going to hear more about the gardens and planting and things tomorrow, because there's a wonderful webinar scheduled for Invasive Species Week tomorrow at 1 o'clock. And but there is a great app that's out for Plant Alert now, and also indeed, for example, Tree Alert. But there's lots of information on the Non-Native Species Secretariat website about how you can get involved with recording non-native species. So I just wanted to begin straight in with all of the ways that you can get involved, and it would just be wonderful to see your sightings coming in, and they do make so much difference. And I hope that's what I'm going to show through this talk, is just the very, very many ways in which those records are useful to so many people. So back in 2019, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services published their global assessment. And this very, very stark message that biodiversity is declining faster than at any time in human history, and that from a calculation, about 1 million species could be at risk of extinction. So quite a stark and quite a depressing message. And if we take a look at what's causing biodiversity change, invasive non-native species are one of the major drivers of biodiversity change, alongside climate change, land use change, exploitation of species and pollution. There are many, many impacts and drivers of change that are affecting the world in which we live, and invasive non-native species are an important part of that. And so it's really critical that we get a better understanding around invasive non-native species, and also we do what we can to prevent the arrival and spread of some of the most damaging species. I think it's really good just to be very clear on the definitions, and non-native species are those species that have been moved from one part of the world to another by humans outside of their native or their natural range. And I often use ladybird examples to illustrate these definitions. And this is the briny ladybird, and you can see from the map it has a very limited distribution, and it just feeds on white bryony. It arrived in the UK, in Surrey actually, in the mid-1990s, and it hasn't gone very far at all. It's had very, very limited spread. And for someone like me who loves ladybirds, it's great to go and get a record of the briny ladybird. In contrast, the subset of all of the non-native species that we term invasive non-native species are those that threaten biodiversity, ecosystems, or the way we live. And the harlequin ladybird is a good example of an invasive non-native species. So it's been introduced by humans. It was introduced in many countries around the world as a biological control agent of insect pests. It's native to a large area of Asia. It arrived in the UK, spreading from mainland Europe. And you can see from this map quite the contrast to the briny ladybird, which had really got very limited spread. The harlequin ladybird spread at more than 100 kilometres per year and is now very commonly encountered throughout England and into Wales, and indeed the sort of borders of Scotland as well. And the reason why we would term it invasive is because it feeds on a whole variety of different insects, not just the pest insects that it was introduced into some European countries and indeed around the world to control. And so it feeds on many different species. It also can be a bit of a human nuisance, forming aggregations in buildings, for example. So we would term it an invasive non-native species. Oops, sorry about that. Hopefully that's going to get that message will disappear. But I think it's really important to have that distinction. And we know that that subset of invasive non-native species is about 10 to 15% of all of the non-native species. And we know that though it's only 10 to 15%, that proportion can cause quite substantial problems. I think also it's really important to say at this point that we wouldn't have these maps and this understanding if it wasn't for volunteer contributions from people out recording, in this case, ladybirds. So it's really inspiring to think of the contributions that people have made to our understanding of these different ladybirds, for instance. So within the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, I'm based within the Biological Record Centre, and I lead the zoology side of things there, which is just really such a great pleasure because I get to work with many, many different volunteer recording schemes and societies. And within the UK, we have so many different recording schemes and societies for very, very many different taxa. And this kind of wheel shows that huge diversity. There's about 80 different recording schemes and societies. And this is really quite unique and amazing in comparison to the rest of the world, because whereas, for example, plants and birds, maybe butterflies are quite commonly recorded in many places around the world, there aren't so many places where someone is recording, for example, springtails or carpet beetles or a whole variety of the other taxa that we see here as well. So we have this really unique perspective on our British wildlife because we have people who are willing to spend their free time compiling records, collecting records, mentoring others in terms of getting them involved with biological recording. And for example, producing these amazing atlases, and this water beetle atlas is just one of the recent atlases from the recording schemes and societies. So it's really fantastic. We have this diversity of activity across the UK, and that data is so valuable in so many different ways. But of course, it's just such a pleasure to be part of this community of biological recorders. So we're celebrating centuries of recording wildlife, and we can look back and see how people used to record on recording cards and producing the maps such as these ones from this very first plant atlas. We can see how technology has changed things. So now we do have things like smartphone apps and online recording, but I think still the sort of joy and the pleasure is probably still the same as it was several hundred years ago, of just connecting with nature and documenting what we see and when we see it and where we see it. And this animation here shows a celebration of 1 year of biological recording. And this is just data coming into the iRecord system. And I think what's amazing is you can see that spatial spread of the records coming in throughout the year, and we get really good coverage of the UK. We can also see there's a whole variety of different taxa being recorded. And as an insect ecologist, I get very excited that that blue line is the one with the most records coming in for the invertebrates. But maybe you're thinking, well, surely it would be the birds, and you would be right. But the bird data comes into a different online system, Bird Tracker, with the British Trust for Ornithology. But nevertheless, isn't it amazing to see that number of records coming in through that iRecord system? Oops. So all of these records, the vast majority are provided by volunteer recorders. And indeed, when we look at this big table here, where I'm trying to define citizen science, that final sort of column where it says biological recording through the national recording schemes, that's the kind of data that I'm talking about here. And within that case, then there are volunteers involved at every step of the process of organizing, of data collection, data verification, interpretation, producing outputs and analysis. Volunteers are absolutely critical at every step of the way. However, there's lots and lots of different ways in which we can think about citizen science. And there's a lot of discussion goes on about defining citizen science. And at the moment, people are talking about maybe calling it community science rather than citizen science. But some people are saying, but community science is much more collaborative than perhaps citizen science is. There's lots of discussions about the terminology. But actually, I just think what is amazing is it's so diverse. There are so many different ways in which people can get involved with science. And perhaps the reason we struggle with the term is because there is that diversity, and there's certainly not one size that fits all. But I think what is really important is that citizen science or community science or public participation with research, whatever we wish to call it, is very much informed and led by communities. People, it's all about the people, and it's all about that connection with nature. So citizen science brings together excellent engagement and excellent science. And I just tried to think of some of the words that we might think about when considering the sort of community level engagement. And I think, quality, diversity, inclusion is so important. Collaboration, sharing knowledge, developing relationships, learning from one another and co-creating and sharing resources, motivating one another, sharing ideas, supporting one another, providing training, sharing the discoveries and interest and excitement, and also perhaps taking action through conservation or informing policies and strategies, and also thinking about awareness and understanding. So when I begin to think about the involvement of volunteers within science, it brings to mind many, many different words, but really it brings to mind a huge celebration of all working together to try and address some of these big challenges that we have before us, such as the threat of invasive alien species or invasive non-native species. So I thought I'd just share a few examples and ways in which the data that comes from volunteers has been so useful in terms of informing our understanding around invasive non-native species. So we're able to document where invasive non-native species are and to map them and to look at trends because of this data and these biological records that we receive from many people. But also volunteers have not only contributed in terms of the occurrence records, but they've also contributed in terms of our understanding of the ecology of these species, of the traits of those species, for instance, the characteristics of those species. And through the GB Non-Native Species Information Portal, which is the project funded by DEFRA, and in collaboration with many, many people, we're able to compile information on all of the non-native species within Britain, which is more than 2,000 species. And we're able to, for example, extract from that the invasive non-native species and inform the UK Biodiversity Indicator by producing these trends on an annual basis as to the number of species and also the extent of those species year on year across marine, terrestrial and freshwater environments. So none of this would be possible if it wasn't for people working together, collaborating, and in particular the volunteers who provide those absolutely critical first records and then document where the species are if indeed they establish and spread. And we're really proud to be able to share this information through ASIN, through the European networks, and indeed onwards to the global systems as well, through, for example, GBIF. This data that we've collated just for GB, we've been able to add to a global data set. And this graph here shows some work by somebody called Hanno Siebens, who has gathered together information from data sets such as R1 in GB with others from all around the world to be able to look at the overall patterns and trends for non-native species worldwide. And what we see is in terms of first records, they're going up and up and up year on year and year. But what's surprising actually is that there's no sign that that's slowing. There seems to be more and more records received every year. And we can talk about all the reasons as to why that might be, but there's no doubt that there is that upward trend. And it doesn't matter which kind of group of animals or plants that you might look at, the trend looks the same. Or indeed, where you are in the world, the trend looks like this, pretty much. But I think it's really amazing as well to think about how we can use these biological records to go beyond the mapping and think about the impacts of some of these species. And again, this is some data that we have from the UK Ladybird Survey, one of these volunteer recording schemes, where because we had such a richness of information on native ladybirds, we were able to look at what effect does the harlequin ladybird's arrival have on the distribution of native species. And I won't go through all of these graphs, but I'm afraid there is another sort of depressing picture, just as the one I showed you right at the beginning, in terms of 7 out of 8 of these species are showing a strong decline, which is really strongly correlated with the arrival of the harlequin ladybird. So their distributions are in decline. And perhaps the one we've seen the most strong decline for is Adalia bipunctata, the two-spot ladybird, which has such a strong overlap with where the harlequin likes to live and what the harlequin likes to eat. And indeed, the harlequin ladybird eats the two-spot ladybirds. So it's perhaps not surprising we had predicted that. But a 44% decline in distribution over such a very short period of time is really quite staggering. Of course, we need to do more and more work on this, and we need to keep getting the data and keep getting the information coming through from people and reviewing these patterns and trends, because things can change. But we wouldn't be able to understand these impacts if it wasn't for data from so many people contributing to this work. And we can begin to now think about, what does this mean for ecosystem function and the resilience of systems? What does this mean for pest control, for example, in Britain? And I think one of the important things here to note as well is it's really important for us to share that data. And we've published these ladybird data sets openly, not only through scientific publications, but also through online databases, for example, the National Biodiversity Network Atlas, and also GBIF. And that open data aspect is really important. So I just wanted to mention it there. But what's also been great for me with the Ladybird Survey is just sharing excitement with other enthusiasts from around the world. And to think that at the same time as us recording ladybirds over here in Britain, there are people recording ladybirds in many other places around the world. And we've worked with collaborators in Chile, for instance, and perhaps slightly frivolously, one of the things we did when we were visiting, Peter Brown, who also oversees the Ladybird Survey, and I, was to go and see if we could find the highest ever harlequin ladybird record, which indeed we did, at 3,578 meters above sea level. And that does sound really frivolous, but actually, in terms of thinking about some of the traits that make the harlequin ladybird, indeed other species, so successful, there are things that we can begin to understand about the harlequin ladybird when we look at it within these more sort of extreme locations. And then I've been really excited to work with Victoria Verenkraut from Argentina, and she's established a citizen science project for the harlequin ladybird in Argentina, using some of the lessons learned from the work that we have been doing here in Britain. I think it's also really exciting now to be moving towards thinking about species interactions. And indeed, if we want to think about ecosystem functions and ecosystem resilience, so things like pollination and pest control, we need to have a better understanding of species interactions. And we need to have a better understanding about how things like climate change and invasive non-native species arrivals are going to affect those species interactions. And so working through, for example, the pollinator monitoring scheme within the UK, we've taken some of the methods that have been developed to use in other places, and in this case, in the UK overseas territories of the Cyprus SBAs. And we've been using some very structured survey techniques, flower insect timed counts, to compare the insect visitation to native and non-native plants, and engaging people to get involved with this very simple but structured method so that we can begin to think more about species interactions. And this is a picture of the Akrotiri wetlands. We've also had the great privilege of working with volunteers to help us in making predictions about biological invasions. So since 2013, 2013, we've been able to use some methods of horizon scanning, which, because of the sheer numbers of species that we might want to look at in terms of which might be the next ones that could arrive in Britain and in one way or another pose a threat. The only way that we can do this is by drawing on the knowledge from a whole variety of different experts with taxonomic expertise that's really far-ranging. And having carried out this exercise back in 2013, we repeated it in 2019 for Britain and came up with some revised priority lists. We still put Vespa velutina very high up, the Asian hornet, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But this is the top 15 species that are considered a major priority in terms of absent at the moment from GB, but that could arrive and pose a problem. And these lists are useful in a whole variety of different ways. They can help in terms of prioritizing species for risk assessments, and we carried out the same horizon scanning activity for the whole of Europe, and the European Commission have been able to use that horizon scanning list alongside other sets of evidence to prioritize species for risk assessment. But we can also think about implementing monitoring and action, and Olaf Boy from the Non-Native Species Secretariat with others has led some really fantastic work in terms of thinking about how to prioritize management of new and emerging invasive alien species in Europe. But we can also think about the ways in which these lists can help us in terms of enhancing biosecurity. And I've had the really great fortune to work through the Non-Native Species Secretariat on a project led by Niall Moore on the UK overseas territories and making predictions around what might be the next species to arrive around the world. So it's just been incredible to go to some really inspiring places and work with inspiring people. And this is a picture of St. Helena with many of the experts from other UK overseas territories who've been involved with this work. But if we wouldn't be able to do it if we didn't pull together those experts, some of them volunteers, many of them volunteers, many of them with just extreme knowledge of the locations where they are, but also for the species as well. And we can also use these lists to help us in terms of monitoring and surveillance. So which species should we be prioritizing, raising awareness and communicating about and getting people involved in even more monitoring and surveillance? And so the horizon scanning that we did within Cyprus through the Darwin Plus initiatives has enabled us to then produce and develop some citizen science initiatives, including that flower insect time count method that I showed to you, but also in the marine environment as well. And this is my youngest daughter, and she was trialing a method which she was very happy to do so in Cyprus for a citizen science initiative monitoring marine invasive alien species. And she was in the water for about 2 hours going through this structured protocol until I thought maybe it was ethical to bring her out of the water and see what she had found. And she really enjoyed it. And we're still promoting this scheme in Cyprus. And that was when Ella was about 26, it was about 16, and she is now 20. So it's a few years ago now. So I mentioned the Asian hornet as well as appearing quite high up on our list of priority. And after we had identified it on the horizon scanning list back in 2013, there began to be a lot of work in terms of promotion and raising awareness around the Asian hornet, some of it targeted specifically to the beekeeping community, others just to make sure that everyone is aware that if they saw an Asian hornet, then it was really critical to get the information as to where they had seen it, so that there could be some action taken very, very quickly. And we set up a whole variety of online recording systems and receiving information by email, but also the Asian Hornet Watch app as well. And this is still really important and still active. And it would be really great if you could be on the lookout this year, as you probably have been over many, many other years. And so this figure here shows that we receive thousands and thousands of reports every single year of suspected Asian hornet records. But I'm really pleased to say, amidst all of those thousands of reports, we only have a few that are confirmed, and every year they have been eradicated. But it's just fantastic that so many people get involved and so many people send in their suspected sightings, and that allows us to then find those few that really are Asian hornets and to inform the bee unit and the secretariat so that that eradication can take place. Of course, receiving thousands and thousands of suspected hornets, and a lot of them are European hornets. Some of them are the hornet mimicking hoverfly, which is a fantastic mimic. Whenever I see it, I always think it's a hornet for about a millisecond, sometimes a bit longer if I'm being a bit slower. And then I realize, nope, it's a hoverfly. So it's really easy to get confused, but it's really important that we still receive those sightings. But one of the things we've been working on is whether we can use image analysis to help us sort through some of these photos, so that we can perhaps prioritize which ones might really be Asian hornets. So it's work in progress, but it's looking really promising. We've also been able to use the data that we've received from people within the UK, but also more widely across Europe, to begin to make some predictions about if the Asian hornet had not been eradicated, where might it have got to? What would our predictions be? And we've coupled environmental suitability models, so looking at where could the species survive and thrive if it did arrive, and also coupling that with a spread model, so thinking about how far it could spread, to look at where it might have been in 2026, for instance, if we hadn't have had that eradication. And for sure, it could have spread quite a long way, and it would have most definitely established and been in many places throughout the south of England and indeed beyond. And actually, if you look at the sort of suitability maps, there are places further north as well, which would be very suitable for the Asian hornet. And so it really highlights how important it is if we wish to eradicate the Asian hornet, that we have that monitoring and surveillance and people really on the lookout for it. So we've also been working on things going back to the Cyprus UK overseas territories, thinking about codes of practice. And again, it's really important that people have involvement within development of things such as the code of practice for mosquito management in European wetlands, because these things won't work if people don't understand why it is you might be asking them to take certain measures or to do certain actions. And actually, by collaboratively working on things like the code of practice, then I believe you're more likely to have success going forward. And so this is some work led by my collaborator, Kelly Martineau from the Cyprus SBAs in developing this framework for the code of practice. And again, involving volunteers in a big way. I thought I'd just mention that we have a cost action all about citizen science and alien or non-native species. And sorry to interchange, but we use non-native species in GB, but in other places across Europe, the term used is alien species, but they're the same thing. But we have the Alien Citizen Science Investigates Cost Action, and it will be running for over another year. So if you're interested and you would like to get involved, do please visit our website. And we've been actually using the pandemic, when we haven't been able to meet face to face, to develop more dissemination materials and more communication materials. And one of the things we'll have out soon is a short animation on citizen science, and specifically about citizen science and invasive alien species. So that's sort of coming soon, probably next week. I will let you know. And I think hopefully I've highlighted to you all just the absolute importance of collaborations and communication. And I'm sure I didn't need to highlight it. I'm sure you're all totally aware of that. And but it gives me an opportunity to just mention a couple of other ongoing initiatives. So I'm currently leading a project for the European Commission on working together to understand invasive alien species across a variety of different sectors. So we're working with the forest sector, angling, aquatic ornamentals, pet species and soil transport. to develop prevention campaigns in a really collaborative way with industry partners and other stakeholders. And I've been really delighted that Lucy has been involved with that project, and indeed showing us things like the Check Clean Dry campaign and Bee Plant Wise to show really how effective a campaign can be that's developed so thoughtfully and involving stakeholders along the way. So it's been really great to have Lucy guiding us through that part. And this project is going to be ongoing for the next few years. So again, perhaps I can come back and chat to you all as we develop further on this project. But if you'd like to know any more, please don't hesitate to get in contact with me. And also the IPBES thematic assessment on invasive alien species and their control is ongoing. It will report in 2023. And I have the great pleasure of being one of the co-chairs, one of the 3 co-chairs for the IPBES assessment. And it really has been such a great joy. I'm learning so much. And again, I'm learning so much because of the collaborations with people all around the world. But there's no doubt that the contributions from volunteers and all of these biological records, for instance, are making a huge impact on that assessment because of the data and evidence that is available from those initiatives. I thought I'd very quickly mention that there are some toolkits for citizen science. If you wish to download those, they are available through the UKCEH website. And just to summarize, I think there's many, many reasons for engaging people with non-native species. We need data to address and understand non-native species and also to inform strategy. We need to engage people in action and decision making. But I think really it's about us all working together. It's about the collaboration and the sense of community and celebrating the excitement of ecology together, and knowing that we can all make a difference if we come together and work together and really begin to think about the ways in which our actions can make a big difference to some of these global drivers of change. And just thinking about that, I wanted to highlight again the webinar that's on tomorrow about attracting wildlife to your garden while protecting the environment from invasive non-native plants. But I also wanted to say, when you're watching that, if you think, well, it would be really great to get involved with monitoring the pollinating insects that might be visiting some of the plants in your garden, then you might like to get involved with the flower insect time counts. And we now have an app available for you to do that. And again, you can find out more by looking at the pollinator monitoring scheme that there's lots of information on the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology website, and would be delighted for you to get involved with monitoring pollinating insects and counting them on native and non-native plants and seeing what the difference is would be really exciting. So thank you to all the amazing collaborators that I've had the opportunity to work with. Thank you to all the incredible volunteers who provide data but also make this a much, much richer and well-rounded experience than it would be otherwise. And thank you to the Non-Native Species Secretariat for all their ongoing support and for being really the reason why we do all manage to come together so effectively. So thank you very much, Lucy.
Thank you, Helen, for such an interesting and inspiring talk. There are so many things that stood out. I thought it was so interesting, like the different ways that citizen science data can be used. So I mean, people could be contributing to like a global data set or helping to protect native wildlife, like with the Asian hornet. And then really interesting as well, the that slide where you were showing the demonstration of the impact. So with the native ladybird and harlequin as well. Yeah, lots that stood out. I'm sure there are going to be plenty of questions. So I'm going to give people a few minutes. If you do have questions, just put them in the Q&A or in the chat. I've got one quickly. I just wondered how you got involved in biological recording to start with, or how and when.
That's a really, really lovely question. So I've just always been interested in wildlife. I just don't remember a time of not being interested in wildlife. And I look at pictures of myself as a young child before I have memories, and you can see that I'm happiest when I'm sort of digging around in a compost heap or a swampy area. And so there's just something, that connection to nature, that's always been incredibly, incredibly special to me. And I can remember, for example, my first ladybird sightings when I was about 6 years old, and it was 1976, and there was a huge boom in ladybirds that year. I was just really fortunate to have been born before then and to be able to remember it. And I then joined as a teenager a local bat group and was really into bat recording. And I have to say, in part, it was because it gave me an excuse to go to the pub because my mum was not desperately approving of me going along to the pub. But if I went along to do bat recording, it was seen as a very respectable thing to be doing. So I have to say there were various motivations during my teenage years. But I've just always enjoyed that connection with nature, and still, like through this pandemic, it just really brightens my day when I go outside and if I see a holly blue or a ladybird or whatever it might be. So I think it's just, the joy of that connection. I think it's so good for mental health and well-being.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's really nice as well. I mean, I'm the same as you. I've always been interested and remember from being tiny. But so one of the first times that I'd worked with you was on the pollinator survey, the citizen science one. And I remember there was a day when we went out with school children and were helping them to record. And I think there must have been some of them who probably hadn't done this before. But as soon as you kind of show them like the joy, they were just so excited to sort of spot things. And yeah, I think it's a really nice way to get people interested in the environment and engaged and kind of caring about it as well. And yeah, so good for mental health, like you say.
Yeah, and I think it's, through my teenage years, it just was so important to me. And I really enjoyed the whole process, for instance, I used to go on a natural history camp with the school and we would write up what we had seen for the Natural History Society magazine. And I really enjoyed that process of science communication, even at that age. And so I think for me, it's always been very linked to sort of science communication, love of ecology and love of wildlife. But I do remember our pollinator work through Open Farm Sunday, and Lucy was an absolute star in her master's project, helping to develop some of the techniques that we're now using through the pollinator monitoring scheme, through the flower insect time count. So essentially what we were doing when we were visiting farms. So yeah, thank you for your fantastic master's work as well, Lucy.
Oh, that's lovely. Okay, I'm going to have a look at some of these questions now. So we have one here. So what criteria do you use to say for certain whether a new invasive non-native species has become established? So for example, Asian hornet's not established, but at what point would you say it has been?
I think that's a really excellent question. And sort of the textbook definition of establishment is around self-sustaining populations, and so sort of reproducing populations. But clearly there's a time when it's difficult for us to know whether there is, and that detectability of knowing whether a species is established or not will sort of vary with different species as to whether, if, for example, we saw a raccoon with pups, if that's the right word for baby raccoons, then we would say that raccoon had established there was a self-sustaining population. But sometimes, it is really tricky, and it will be really tricky for some species that aren't as charismatic as the Asian hornet that we may just not be on the lookout for. And so it might be that they have then really become very well established before we notice. So I think it's a really good question, but the textbook answer is it's about the self-sustaining populations. But of course, it's not always easy to tell. And then we think about as well, just to add, some of the, for example, the terrapins, which aren't going to be reproducing within water bodies in the UK, but there's no doubt that they're self-sustaining in the sense that they're there for a very, very long time, and their populations get replenished if people release them time and time again. So it is really important with things like the terrapins not to be releasing them into waterways, because they will be there for an incredibly long time, even if they can't reproduce.
Yeah, that's so true. So here's another one. International collaboration is clearly critical. What impact, if any, do you think that Brexit will have on our ability to better understand and manage the threats to UK biodiversity from invasive species?
Again, I think that's just a really, really excellent question. And I think, and I'm probably going to sound very sycophantic in saying this, but we are so fortunate in having the Non-Native Species Secretariat, because there aren't that many of you in the Secretariat, but the work that you do is so important in bringing us all together and helping us also to have that international outlook as well. So I think regardless of the politics, we will all continue to collaborate and work together. And because we have the fantastic Secretariat helping in so many different ways, I'm as optimistic as ever that we will most definitely manage the threats to UK biodiversity. And we will just go from strength to strength because of the collaborations that we have.
I think as well, a lot of people working in this area really care about this anyway. So there's still a lot of collaboration across the EU and lots of people still working together.
It's incredible so for example, the cost networks, the communities of people that come together are just amazing and just inspiring. And when I think about the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity Services thematic assessment, I just constantly, every time we meet, I feel inspired by the people I'm getting to meet from all around the world, and our desire to work together to address the problem in a really objective and evidence-based way. And that will continue, and volunteers will continue to be interested regardless of the politics of the time.
There's a question here about where we can find the resources and guides to citizen science. There'll be an email coming out tomorrow, so a day after this, and I'll put all of the links from the talk into that for everyone who's attended. So we'll make sure they're all in there. There's one here. What do you recommend to countries or nations who don't have a long tradition in citizen science? How can they start and how can they keep people interested? It's a nice question.
Yeah, I think it's a really excellent question. And I do feel that we are really, really fortunate in the UK to have such a legacy of biological recording that has gone on for centuries and centuries. And it's really wonderful to see initiatives being developed in other parts of the world. But I think we do have a head start because we do already have that kind of culture and the infrastructure for it. But I think that having things such as sort of coordinating bodies, whether they be volunteers still. So, for example, on our recording schemes, all of the recording schemes are led by volunteers who will bring together other enthusiasts. And I think that kind of raising awareness is really important, and sharing enthusiasm. And it does take quite a lot of time, but it's incredibly enjoyable. I think also about adapting to use different tools. So, for example, Victoria Verenkraut, who came over to have sabbatical time with me here and to learn about the UK Ladybird survey and biological recording in the way that we did it. Back in Argentina, some of the things that we do here just were not working. And actually what worked really well for Victoria was to put the survey onto WhatsApp and to start using WhatsApp. And although it was quite kind of intensive in terms of the amount of time to go through each record, as the community then grew, she could then kind of start to link them into online systems that were easier to use. But I think it's about being adaptable and flexible to your community and working with your communities to know what do they want from all of this? What is everybody going to get from this, and what will work best for them? So that kind of community engagement is really important. And I see the questions come from Kelly in Cyprus, and she is already building up fantastic community engagement through the work that she's been doing through the Darwin Plus projects alongside Jodie Paynton and others to implement pollinator monitoring, for example, but also amazing awareness around mosquitoes and other things as well.
I think we've got time for one more question. I don't want to keep you too long, but if there are any others, you can contact us and I'll pass them on to Helen. I'm sure she won't mind answering. So for last one, do the numbers of records vary with the accessibility of the habitat system recorders? So places like freshwater or marine might be a lot harder for people to get to. And is there anything in place to encourage more recording in those type of less accessible habitats?
Yeah, another really, really excellent question. And there's no doubt about it that there is sort of bias in the data in all kinds of ways, whether it be to do with accessibility of habitats or whether it be to do with just some of the species are very, very tricky to identify. I went on a solitary bee course. I just struggle with solitary bees, but thankfully there are people out there who are fantastic at identifying solitary bees. So I think, there are taxonomic biases, there are spatial biases, temporal biases, habitat biases, and as you say, in the aquatic environments, it can be tricky as well. But I think what's really exciting is the way in which there are new technologies and new ways of interacting with people, and the technologies that are developing that will mean that we'll be able to do more and more going forward. So, for example, using acoustic techniques in some habitats where it might not be penetrable, using drones in some habitats, or these many different new technologies, and there's really some fantastic work that's going on in that. And actually through the Cost Action Network, we've been having a workshop this week on new technologies within citizen science, and it's just really exciting to think about the ways in which, for example, acoustic technologies could be used for recording grasshoppers and crickets, or indeed frogs and other species as well, and the ways in which drones are being flown over forests to look look at processionary moths, for instance, across Europe. So just incredible to think of the eDNA technologies that using environmental DNA to be able to see which species are in aquatic water bodies. So I think, it's going to get, the sort of detectability is going to get better, and the diversity of ways in which people can get involved, it's just growing. So it's really exciting times.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, I think that's probably all we have time for. As I said, we'll send out an email tomorrow with all the links from the talks, and this will be available online for if you want to share it with anyone who's missed it. So thank you everyone for joining this afternoon, and thank you so much, Helen, as well, for taking the time to do this. I know you're very busy, and yeah, it was a brilliant talk.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Really exciting.
Oh, yeah, absolute pleasure. And yeah, thank you to everyone for being here. And yeah, enjoy the rest of Invasive Species Week and enjoy the talk tomorrow.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And thank you, Lucy, for organising it for us.
Thank you. Bye.